Welcome back to What's That Bass Wednesday. This is the answer to yesterday's What's That Bass Wednesday. This single fish here, very memorable for sure, kind of nightmarish in a way. So, what is the story with this fish? Some of you may have seen this fish before. If you have ever been and seen any of my talks that I've given, this fish has shown up in some of them in the past. Some fish, are so ugly that they just stick in your mind. And this is one of those kinds of fish. I remember showing this fish one time at a talk years ago, and one of the folks at the talk told me afterwards that for months later, he had had nightmares about this fish. And I can see why, because this is definitely not exactly a pretty animal. This fish does have serious significance in terms of black bass conservation. They say a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step, and the same is true for conservation. This fish represents the first step in what has turned out to be a journey none of us could have imagined when we first laid eyes on this critter. The year was 2005, so 20 years ago. And this fish had just been collected from a tributary of the Chattahoochee River in Alabama. We were in the midst of a project to determine the fate of shoal bass in Alabama. Spoiler alert, that fate was not pretty. And at some point we will cover that here on this channel. We were collecting a lot of quote unquote spotted bass and a few others that looked a little odd, but no shoal bass. And then this fish rolled up. It was certainly an attention getter, to say the least. Up until that point, genetics were the furthest thing from our minds. Our focus was more on how many of this species did we get versus how many of that species did we get. No genetic surveys had taken place in the range of shoal bass up to this point. So this fish obviously made us think about genetics. So naturally, we took some samples from this fish, which we had never done before. And we took it from a few other fish that looked a little odd as well. And we sent them to someone who at the time was one of the very few black bass geneticists in the country. And all the fish we sent that guy came back as hybrids. And most of them were actually between spotted bass and shoal bass. But this ugly dude, this nightmare frankenfish, was actually a spotted bass largemouth bass hybrid, the first one we had ever seen, and hopefully the last, to be honest. Haven't actually identified a genetic mix of this since, which is a good thing. So a few years later, we did a more comprehensive survey of the Chattahoochee River Basin, especially after sampling in the river itself and finding lots of weird-looking fish. And the rest, as they say, was history. Those of you who have been following this journey across social media, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or now the most recent one here on YouTube, you know by now that the Chattahoochee is a hot mess of black bass genetics with 3 and 4 and even 5-way crosses, not all that uncommon to be found in it. Pure fish are really at a premium, and shoal bass are in decline all across the basin. Our focus shifted primarily toward shoal bass genetic integrity, and this expanded through time to genetic integrity of all black bass. And the more we looked, the worse it got. Native black bass all throughout the South were under serious threat of intraggressive hybridization with non-native congeners, and sometimes with native congeners. And what we realized was that the same thing that the Western trout biologists had found out about native trout in their part of the world decades and decades ago. And that is that hybridization is a major conservation problem. And just like those Western cutthroat trout that in their case were being hybridized out of existence by non-native rainbow trout stockings, here, non-native bass being introduced into the range of native black bass was having the same thing of native genes being replaced by non-native genes. So this genetic integrity becomes the focus of what needs to be protected in terms of conservation. It's not enough to restore habitat and protect fish from overfishing. The real threat to our native black bass is hybridization. And this is something that they cannot really recover from, and it's really hard to reverse, especially in larger systems. And the centerpiece of our efforts has to be stopping the spread of non-native bass, or all our other efforts would be useless. And so the focus really started shifting from habitat, which is still important, don't get me wrong, but if the genetics are screwed up, it doesn't matter what the habitat is anymore. And so a movement began on that day 20 years ago, a wave that seems to grow a little higher, a little stronger with each passing year. And, this channel is now part of this larger movement to get the word out about the importance and the threat of non-native hybridization to our native black bass populations. And hopefully you all are getting the message and, more importantly, passing it on to those who may not be followers of the Facebook page or subscribers to this YouTube channel. But it's funny how one fish can sometimes change our perspective of what's going on. An attention grabber, something that you're not likely to forget, like this monstrosity pulled from a little stream in Alabama so many years ago. So thank you so much for your attention. Hope you learned something today. More importantly, I hope you're going to pass the message along. Don't move bass. Have a nice day, folks.